Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We're all about getting to the heart of complex issues without drowning in a sea of information. Those issues that make you go, man, I wish I understood what was really going on here.
Exactly. It's so easy to get lost in the headlines and miss the bigger picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And today we're tackling a big one. The EU's plan to completely stop importing natural gas from Russia. They're aiming for 2027, but it's proving to be way more complicated than just flipping a switch. We've got this in-depth report that really digs into all the challenges and, frankly, some of the surprising twists and turns. It's not just about politics, it's about energy security, the global economy, and even the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, the report really lays it all out, doesn't it? The current state of play, the roadblocks, the things no one saw coming. It makes you realize that even with the best intentions, this is a seriously tough goal. It really does. So today, we're going to try to answer a few key questions. How close is the EU to actually hitting that 2027 target? What's making this so difficult? And what are the ripple effects, the unintended consequences of all these changes? Because we're talking about a huge shift in the energy landscape, and that has implications for everyone.
For sure. And to kick things off, let's dive straight into one of the most surprising findings from the report. The fact that despite the EU's pledge to ditch Russian gas, imports actually went up last year.
Yeah, that's the headline that made me do a double take. 18% increase in 2024. You'd think it would be the other way around, right?
Right. You'd expect a steady decline as they move away from Russian energy. But the numbers tell a different story. And it wasn't just a small uptick here and there. We're talking significant increases from several countries. Italy bumped up their imports by a whopping 4 billion cubic meters. Czechia tacked on another 2 bcmeters, and France wasn't far behind, adding 1.7 bcmeters.
Yeah, and here's the thing. It doesn't look like this was just a blip in 2024. The report suggests this trend is continuing into 2025. Both LNG, liquefied natural gas, and the gas flowing through the Turk Stream pipeline are showing increases.
Exactly. And when you look at the February 2025 figures, it's even more striking. Russian LNG imports jumped by 11% that month, reaching 74.3 million cubic meters per day. And the Turk Stream pipeline import saw a similar bump, also up 11%, hitting 56 million cubic meters per day.
So how is this even happening? The EU is trying to cut ties with the Russian energy, but the numbers say otherwise. What's going on behind the scenes?
The report sheds some light on that. It seems Russia is finding ways to keep supplying gas, even with all the political pressure and sanctions. One of the key factors is the rise in LNG imports. They're harder to track and regulate than pipeline gas.
Right. LNG is like the wild card in this whole situation. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in things like shadow vessels and whitewashing. These are tactics that, well, they make it even harder to pinpoint where the gas is really coming from.
It's like trying to trace a package that's been relabeled and rerouted multiple times. Shadow vessels, they often operate under flags of convenience, with less stringent regulations. And whitewashing in this context could involve blending Russian gas with gas from other sources to make it harder to identify.
So it's coming in through the back door, essentially. And there are real-world examples of this. Germany, they've banned direct imports of Russian LNG, but they're still buying it through other European ports.
It just goes to show how difficult it is to achieve a complete cutoff when there's this much at stake. And to really grasp the magnitude of this ongoing trade, let's look at the financial side. In 2024, the EU spent a staggering 21.9 billion euros on Russian fossil fuels.
Wow, that's a huge amount. And here's the kicker. It's actually more than the 18.7 billion euros they gave to Ukraine in financial aid that same year. Talk about mixed messages, right?
It really highlights the tension between the EU's political goals and its economic realities. Some countries, like Slovakia and Hungary, are still advocating for continued Russian gas imports.
I guess it makes sense from a purely economic standpoint. I mean, wouldn't any country jump at the chance to get gas at a discounted price?
Yeah, especially when those discounts can be significant. Our analysis shows that countries like Hungary might be paying as much as, well, let's just say it's a lot less than market rates. It creates a strong incentive to keep those imports flowing.
So they're weighing those economic benefits against the political risks and the ethical considerations of supporting Russia in the current climate. It's a tough balancing act.
Absolutely. And speaking of tough situations, let's move on to the second major point. The wild ride that gas prices have been on. The report shows a whopping 59% increase in EU gas prices throughout 2024.
Yeah, and the European benchmark, the TTF, it's doubled compared to pre-crisis levels. It's hitting everyone's wallets, from businesses to everyday consumers.
And for European industries, it's even more painful. They're now paying double for power compared to their competitors in the US and China. That puts them at a serious disadvantage in the global market.
It's like running a race with ankle weights, you know? You can't compete effectively when your energy costs are so much higher. And the report also points out the inherent volatility of relying on LNG. It's a global market, so the EU is now competing with Asia for those shipments.
Exactly. And the prices can swing dramatically depending on supply and demand around the world. It's a far cry from the relative stability of pipeline gas, where you typically have longer-term contracts.
So what's the solution? Is there a way to bring those prices down and create a more stable energy market?
The report cautions against a seemingly easy fix. Just restart Russian pipeline gas flows. You might see a quick drop in prices, but
Yeah, but then you're right back to square one. You're dependent on Russia again, and you're potentially propping up their economy, which runs counter to all the political goals.
exactly. It's a Band-Aid solution that doesn't address the underlying issue. It's short-sighted and could create even bigger problems down the line.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. And speaking of short-sightedness, the UK's situation is a prime example of how costly this gas price volatility can be. They've spent way more on wholesale gas in the past 4 years than they've even budgeted for expanding their electricity grid in the next 5.
Really puts into perspective how much money is being thrown at this problem without necessarily addressing the root causes.
It's like throwing money into a black hole.
It is a bit like that. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what the EU is actually doing to address this energy crunch. The report highlights a massive increase in planned gas infrastructure.
They're going all in on building new ways to get gas, right? Pipelines, LNG terminals, the whole works.
Exactly. They're projecting a 30% increase in gas supply capacity by 2030, and a big chunk of that is driven by LNG. Import capacity for LNG is set to skyrocket by 54%. And there are new pipeline projects on the horizon, like the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline expansion and the East Med Pipeline, which should add at least 20 DC meters of capacity.
So on the surface, it sounds like they're taking this energy security thing seriously. More options, more sources, less reliance on any one supplier. But here's where things get a little puzzling. The projected growth in actual gas demand is nowhere near as dramatic.
That's right. Even in scenarios where demand doesn't drop significantly due to energy efficiency measures and the shift to renewables, it's only expected to increase by a modest 4% between 2023 and 2030.
Hold on, they're ramping up supply capacity by a huge margin, but demand is only inching up. That sounds like a recipe for, well, a lot of wasted infrastructure.
That's precisely the concern raised by the report. They estimate that by 2030, the EU could have a surplus of 131 billion cubic meters of gas supply capacity. That's enough to meet the annual gas needs of Germany, France, and Poland combined.
Wow, that's a lot of empty pipelines and idle LNG terminals. Talk about a potential financial sinkhole. And the report suggests that this gap between supply and demand is only going to widen as energy efficiency efforts and renewable energy deployments continue to grow. It's already happening. LNG terminal utilization rates are dropping. They went from 63% in 2022 down to 58.5% in 2023. And last year, half of the EU's LNG terminals were operating below 40% capacity.
It raises serious questions about the economic viability of these investments. Are they really the best use of resources, especially considering the EU's climate goals? And it's not just about new infrastructure. The report points out that there are existing bottlenecks within the EU's gas network, particularly on the west-east routes. These bottlenecks can drive up prices in certain regions and limit the efficient flow of gas. Plus, there's the potential to better utilize Ukraine's gas storage facilities, which are already substantial and could provide a boost to the EU's energy security without the need for brand new projects.
So there are options on the table that don't involve pouring billions into new pipelines and terminals. Yet, the report highlights that over 37 billion euros are still being funneled into gas infrastructure development. And this is largely happening without direct financial support from the EU under the 10E regulation, which is specifically designed to fund energy projects. There are a few exceptions, like the EastMed and Melita projects, but for the most part, this investment is coming from elsewhere. It suggests a disconnect between the EU's stated goals for security, affordability, and climate change and the actual investments being made.
It does make you wonder about the driving forces behind these projects. Is it purely about energy security, or are there other economic and political factors at play? Well, let's move on to the part of the report that I find most interesting, the recommendations. They lay out a roadmap for how the EU can actually achieve this Russian gas phase-out by 2027. And their suggestions are, well, they're pretty bold.
Lay it on us. What's the plan?
First and foremost, they call for a legally binding target. No more vague promises or political posturing. They want to see a concrete, enforceable commitment to phasing out Russian gas by 2027. And they even suggest providing technical assistance to countries like Slovakia and Hungary, which are more heavily reliant on Russian gas, to help them diversify their energy sources.
So it's not just about setting a goal, it's about giving countries the tools to actually meet it. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And the second recommendation is all about avoiding the trap of simply replacing one dependency with another. Instead of pouring money into LNG projects in other parts of the world and locking themselves into long-term contracts, they urge the EU to focus on domestic solutions. Things like electrifying everything they can, improving the electricity grid, investing in energy storage, and really pushing for decentralized renewable energy sources. It's about building a more self-sufficient and ultimately cleaner energy system.
It's a much more sustainable approach in the long run. It's not just about swapping suppliers, it's about fundamentally changing the way energy is produced and consumed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the third recommendation focuses on reducing overall gas demand. This involves a whole suite of measures, like stricter energy efficiency standards, incentivizing building renovations to reduce energy consumption, and promoting the electrification of buildings and industries. If you use less gas, you need less of it. Simple as that.
Makes sense. And it aligns perfectly with those climate goals.
Precisely. The fourth recommendation is about getting the most out of the existing gas infrastructure. They suggest standardizing the fees for interconnecting gas networks and using storage facilities, which would make the system more efficient overall. And they highlight the importance of integrating Ukraine's existing gas storage capacity into the EU system. It's a huge potential resource that's right on their doorstep.
So before building new stuff, make sure you're using what you already have to its full potential. Efficiency is key.
The fifth recommendation is all about big picture thinking. They call for a more integrated approach to planning gas and electricity infrastructure. Too often, these systems are treated as separate entities, which can lead to inefficiencies and missed opportunities for synergy. A more holistic approach would ensure that investments are made strategically and that both systems work together seamlessly.
It's like planning a city without thinking about how the roads and the public transportation system will connect. It just doesn't make sense.
The great analogy. And the sixth recommendation is about transparency and data. They want to see much better data availability on LNG imports and gas infrastructure development. This would allow for more informed policymaking and better enforcement of regulations. You can't manage what you can't measure.
Data is king. It's essential for making smart decisions.
Exactly. And finally, they circle back to the need for concrete action. They specifically suggest an LNG price cap and a ban on spot market purchases of Russian gas. This would send a strong signal to the market and make it much harder for Russian gas to find its way into the EU.
It's about putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak. It's time for the EU to stop talking and start taking decisive steps.
Absolutely. And if we look at all these recommendations together, they paint a clear picture of what a successful energy transition could look like for the EU. It's about breaking free from dependence on Russian gas, diversifying energy sources, embracing efficiency and renewables, and ultimately building a more sustainable and resilient energy system.
So, for you, the listener, what are the key takeaways from all of this? Well, first off, despite the EU's stated goals, imports of Russian gas actually went up last year. That's a big red flag, and it's contributing to the ongoing roller coaster of gas prices, which is hurting European economies. There's a real risk that the EU is overinvesting in gas infrastructure that might end up sitting idle as demand plateaus or even declines. And ultimately, it's going to take strong, legally binding actions to really achieve this Russian gas phase-out by 2027. It can't just be wishful thinking.
This whole deep dive really highlights how interconnected all these issues are.
Yeah.
The import figures, the price fluctuations, the infrastructure investments, they all feed into each other. And it shows just how complex and challenging a major energy transition could be.
It's a real eye-opener. And it leaves us with a big question. Will the EU's current trajectory lead them to a truly secure and sustainable energy future? Or will short-term economic interests ultimately undermine their long-term goals? It's a question for all of us to ponder, both as citizens and as policymakers. What role can we play in ensuring a successful and sustainable energy transition? We encourage you to delve deeper into this issue. The full report from Ember is a great place to start. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.